The report on Colonel Fritz von Reichert's desk violated every principle of guided weaponry taught at Peenemünde. September 14, 1944. The numbers stared back at him from the typed pages. 75% of the V-1 flying bombs launched toward London in the past week had failed to reach their targets. This could not be accurate. Von Reichert called for his aide. He demanded verification of the statistics. The aide returned 30 minutes later, with confirmation from 3 separate tracking stations. The numbers were correct. 3 out of every 4 of Germany's most advanced guided missiles were failing. The colonel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the telephone to call Berlin. The V-1 flying bomb represented the pinnacle of German engineering. Each unit cost 5,000 Reichsmarks to produce. The weapon could fly at 400 miles per hour. Its pulse-jet engine gave it a range of 150 miles. The internal gyroscope and radio guidance system guaranteed accuracy within 500 meters of the target. German scientists had spent 4 years perfecting the design at the secret Peenemünde facility on the Baltic coast. The V-2 ballistic missile was even more impressive. Standing 46 feet tall and weighing 14 tons, it could deliver a 1-ton warhead at supersonic speeds. The cost reached 125,000 Reichsmarks per missile. Its radio guidance system used multiple frequencies to prevent interference. German engineers considered it immune to any countermeasures the Allies might develop. These weapons were supposed to turn the tide of the war. Hitler himself had declared them the instruments of final victory. The German High Command had calculated that London would surrender within 6 weeks of sustained bombardment. The mathematics were simple. Each day, Germany could launch 100 V-1s and 20 V-2s. With an 80% success rate, this meant 96 successful strikes daily. No city could withstand such punishment. The early deployments had matched these predictions perfectly. In June 1944, during the first week of V-1 attacks, 82% reached their targets. British anti-aircraft guns proved largely ineffective. Fighter planes could barely match the flying bomb's speed. The psychological impact on London's population was immediate and severe. German monitoring stations intercepted British radio transmissions describing panic in the streets. Dr. Werner Kellner, the chief scientist at Peenemünde, had personally assured the German High Command that jamming their guidance systems was impossible. The probability of successfully interfering with the multi-frequency radio controls was less than 1 in 10,000. This was not propaganda or wishful thinking. It was sound electromagnetic science. The Germans had tested their systems against every known form of interference. The Fritz X guided bomb had already proven the reliability of German radio guidance. In September 1943, it had sunk the Italian battleship Roma. The HS-293 glide bomb had destroyed dozens of Allied ships in the Mediterranean. These weapons used the same fundamental guidance principles as the V-1 and V-2. Their success rate exceeded 60% even in combat conditions. German confidence in their technological superiority was absolute. They had invented the guided missile. They had pioneered radio control systems. The scientists at Peenemünde included some of the finest minds in physics and engineering. Many had studied at the best universities in Europe. They understood the mathematics of radio waves and electromagnetic interference better than anyone. The production facilities reflected this confidence. The underground factory at Mittelwerk employed 30,000 workers. Most were slave laborers from concentration camps. They assembled V-2 rockets in tunnels carved into the Harz Mountains. The facility could produce 30 missiles per day. Similar factories manufactured V-1 flying bombs at an even faster rate. Yet now the impossible numbers sat on von Reichert's desk. 75% failure rate. The tracking stations reported the same pattern repeatedly. The missiles launched successfully. They flew normally for most of their journey. Then, in the final miles before reaching London, they would suddenly veer off course. Some dove into the English Channel. Others crashed into empty fields. A few simply exploded in mid-air. The colonel stared at the reports. Every principle of German science said these numbers were impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. Something was destroying their perfect weapons, something they could not see or understand. The pattern emerged slowly over the weeks following D-Day. German Missile Command tracked every launch with meticulous precision. During the first 2 weeks of June 1944, V-1 failure rates remained at expected levels. 10 to 15% of the flying bombs missed their targets. This fell within normal operational parameters. Weather conditions and mechanical failures accounted for these losses. By the third week of June, the failure rate climbed to 30%. German technicians blamed atmospheric interference. Summer thunderstorms over the English Channel could theoretically disrupt radio signals. The explanation satisfied no one, but alternatives seemed impossible. Engineers at Peenemünde ordered recalibration of all guidance transmitters. The fourth week brought failure rates approaching 50%. This defied all logic. German operators reported perfect signal strength throughout each flight. The radio connections remained stable. The guidance commands transmitted clearly, yet half the missiles suddenly changed course in their final approach to London. They dove into the sea or crashed into the countryside miles from any strategic target. By early August, the situation had become catastrophic. 75% of V-1s failed to reach London. The more advanced V-2 rockets showed similar problems. Launch crews followed every procedure perfectly. The missiles rose normally from their launch rails. They flew straight and true for hundreds of miles. Then, in the last 60 seconds of flight, they would veer wildly off course. German observers stationed along the French coast witnessed phenomena they could not explain. V-1 flying bombs would suddenly pitch downward at impossible angles. Some entered vertical dives from 3,000 feet. Others began circular patterns, spiraling until they crashed. So few reversed direction entirely, flying back toward German positions before running out of fuel. The V-2 rockets displayed different but equally puzzling behavior. These supersonic missiles would maintain perfect trajectories until the final descent phase. Then they would shift course by 10 or 20 degrees. A rocket aimed at central London would impact in rural Kent. One targeted at Portsmouth struck empty farmland 30 miles inland. The Fritz X guided bombs suffered the worst degradation. These precision weapons had once achieved direct hits on moving ships. Now they missed stationary targets by hundreds of meters. German bomber crews reported that the bombs responded normally to radio commands initially. Then control would suddenly cease. The bombs would glide away from their intended targets as if pulled by invisible hands. Naval units deploying HS-293 glide bombs experienced similar frustrations. These weapons had terrorized Allied shipping in 1943. Now they spiraled uselessly into the ocean. Luftwaffe pilots described watching their bombs enter uncontrolled rolls. Some wobbled like autumn leaves. Others flew in perfect circles until crashing into the waves. German intelligence intercepted British radio communications that deepened the mystery. The British were not firing massive barrages of anti-aircraft shells. They were not sending up hundreds of fighter aircraft. American and British forces seemed to expend minimal ammunition. Yet German missiles fell from the sky at unprecedented rates. Technical teams examined recovered missile wreckage whenever possible. They found no evidence of physical damage from enemy fire. The guidance receivers appeared intact. The control surfaces functioned normally. Every component checked out perfectly. The missiles had simply stopped responding to commands. Some German officers suspected sabotage at the production facilities. The SS launched investigations at Mittelwerk and other factories. They found nothing. The slave laborers had no access to critical components. German supervisors monitored every stage of assembly. Test flights from secure locations showed normal performance. The problems only appeared when missiles approached British airspace. Weather specialists studied atmospheric conditions over the English Channel. They found no unusual patterns that could explain the failures. Radio engineers measured background electromagnetic radiation. The readings were normal. Astronomers even checked for solar flare activity that might interfere with radio waves. They discovered nothing significant. By September 1944, German missile crews operated in a state of bewildered frustration. They launched perfect weapons that failed for incomprehensible reasons. Every scientific principle they knew said this was impossible. Yet they watched it happen day after day. The Americans called it the AN/TPQ-2. To the workers assembling it in factories across the United States, it was simply another mysterious box of electronics destined for the war effort. The device measured 3 feet by 2 feet and weighed 40 pounds. Inside, a complex array of vacuum tubes and circuits could generate radio signals across multiple frequency bands simultaneously. When activated, it created an invisible wall of electromagnetic interference that severed the connection between German missiles and their controllers. The British had developed their own versions. Operation Jostle employed modified transmitters that flooded the 48 to 50 MHz frequencies used by German guidance systems. The cigar jammers targeted different wavelengths. Operation Carpet scattered aluminum strips from aircraft to create radar confusion. Together, these systems formed an electronic shield over southern England. The principle was deceptively simple. German missiles relied on radio signals to maintain course. The guidance transmitter sent commands. The missile's receiver interpreted these commands and adjusted control surfaces accordingly. If you could overpower the legitimate signal with noise, the missile would lose its way. It was like shouting over someone trying to give directions. The person following directions would become lost. What made this revolutionary was the broadband capability. Previous jamming attempts had focused on single frequencies. The Germans could simply switch to alternate channels. The American jammers broadcast across the entire spectrum, used by German guidance systems. There was nowhere for the enemy signals to hide. The technology carried the same security classification as the atomic bomb project. Documents bore the stamp Ultra Secret. Only a handful of Allied commanders knew the full capabilities of these devices. Even the operators received limited information. They knew their equipment interfered with enemy weapons. They did not know they were winning the war against Hitler's wonder weapons. The jammers had proven themselves on D-Day. As Allied forces stormed the Normandy beaches, electronic warfare units activated their equipment. German glide bombs targeting the invasion fleet veered harmlessly into the sea. Radio-controlled tanks that were supposed to attack the landing craft drove in circles before shutting down. The invasion succeeded partly because German precision weapons had been rendered blind. The MIT Radiation Laboratory had led the American development effort. Scientists who had been working on radar systems redirected their expertise toward jamming technology. They studied captured German equipment. They analyzed the frequencies used by V1 and V2 guidance systems. Within months, they had designed countermeasures that could defeat any radio-guided weapon. The Germans had actually attempted similar technology earlier in the war. In 1940, they tried to jam British radar during the Battle of Britain. The efforts failed because German scientists concluded that effective broadband jamming required impossibly large power outputs. They calculated that a jamming transmitter would need to be the size of a building to generate sufficient interference. This assumption would prove fatal to their missile program. American engineers solved the power problem through clever circuit design. They discovered that you did not need to overpower the enemy signal completely. You only needed to introduce enough noise to confuse the receiver. A relatively small transmitter could achieve this if it operated on the exact frequencies used by German guidance systems. Precision replaced brute force. The production statistics told the real story of the war. American factories manufactured over 40,000 jamming units between 1943 and 1945. The cost per unit dropped from $2,000 to just $75 as mass production techniques improved. 15 different factories across 7 states participated in the program. From Boston to Los Angeles, assembly lines churned out electronic weapons. 30,000 workers contributed to the jamming device production. 60% were women who had never worked in electronics before the war. They followed detailed instruction sheets. They soldered connections and tested circuits. They packed completed units for shipment overseas. Most had no idea they were building the devices that would save London from destruction. The German missile program operated on an entirely different scale. Mittelwerk produced 30 V2 rockets daily using slave labor. Each rocket required hundreds of hours of skilled assembly. The guidance systems were hand-calibrated by trained technicians. Germany could manufacture hundreds of missiles. America could manufacture tens of thousands of jammers. The mathematics of this mismatch would determine the war's outcome. The security surrounding the Allied jamming program rivaled that of any wartime secret. Production was deliberately scattered across multiple states to prevent any single location from understanding the full scope. A factory in Michigan manufactured power supplies. A facility in Pennsylvania produced antenna arrays. Workers in California assembled circuit boards. None knew how their components fit into the larger system. The military assigned meaningless code names to conceal the true purpose. Operation Carpet sounded like a bombing campaign. Project Window suggested defensive preparations. Moonshine could have meant anything. Even high-ranking officers outside the electronic warfare units assumed these were conventional anti-aircraft programs. The deception was so complete that many Allied personnel never learned the truth until after the war. Physical security measures proved equally important. When jamming equipment occasionally failed and fell into enemy territory, recovery teams moved immediately. They retrieved devices before German patrols could investigate. In cases where recovery was impossible, thermite charges destroyed the evidence. The few units that Germans did capture arrived so damaged that reconstruction was impossible. American workers assembling the jammers received strict instructions about secrecy. They signed papers threatening imprisonment for discussing their work. Factory managers told them they were building radar equipment. The components looked similar enough to make this believable. Women on the assembly lines thought they were helping Allied pilots detect enemy aircraft. They had no idea they were neutralizing Hitler's most feared weapons. The compartmentalization extended to the military operators. Technicians who activated the jammers knew only that their equipment should be turned on when enemy missiles approached. They did not understand the technical principles. They could not explain how radio frequency interference worked. If captured, they could reveal nothing of value to German interrogators. Meanwhile, German intelligence services chased shadows. They knew something was defeating their missiles, but could not identify what. Agents in England searched for new anti-aircraft weapons. They looked for massive gun emplacements that did not exist. They sought evidence of revolutionary fighter aircraft that had never been built. The truth sat in small trucks parked quietly around London, anonymous boxes humming with electronic noise. The Germans did capture some jamming equipment during the war. In August 1944, a damaged American bomber crashed in occupied France. The crew had failed to destroy their electronic warfare systems. German technicians examined the wreckage. They found what appeared to be a malfunctioning radar unit. The circuits made no sense for detection purposes. The device seemed designed to broadcast rather than receive. They classified it as defective Allied radar and filed it away. Another opportunity came in September 1944. A British jamming truck was abandoned during a hasty retreat in Holland. German engineers spent days studying the equipment. They concluded it was meant to interfere with German radar stations. This was partially correct but missed the crucial point. The system could jam any radio frequency, including missile guidance channels. The Germans never made this connection. German assumptions about Allied technical capabilities created blind spots. They believed the Americans and British lagged behind in electronics. The idea that the Allies had developed superior jamming technology seemed impossible. German scientists had declared broadband jamming impractical. Therefore, the Allies could not have achieved it. This circular logic prevented them from recognizing evidence directly in front of them. Intercepted Allied communications added to the confusion. The Americans and British used code phrases that meant nothing to German listeners. Reports of carpet bombing were taken literally. References to window openings seemed like weather observations. Even when Germans monitored discussions about electronic countermeasures, they assumed these referred to radar jamming, not missile guidance interference. The German focus on finding spies and saboteurs diverted resources from discovering the truth. The SS investigated factory workers at Mittelwerk repeatedly. They interrogated launch crews about possible treachery. They searched for Allied agents among the civilian population. All these efforts failed because they were looking for human enemies rather than electronic ones. By late 1944, some German scientists began to suspect electronic interference. They lacked proof and faced ridicule from colleagues who insisted jamming was impossible. The few who pushed for investigation were overruled. The missile program had invested too much to admit such a fundamental vulnerability. October 15, 1944, became the worst day in the history of German missile warfare. Launch crews positioned along the Dutch coast fired 127 V-1 flying bombs toward London between dawn and dusk. Allied tracking stations confirmed that 119 never reached their targets. The success rate had fallen to 6%. At Peenemünde, emergency meetings convened as the impossible statistics arrived by encrypted telegraph. General Walter Dornberger, head of the V2 program, demanded explanations from his technical staff. The engineers had no answers. They had changed frequencies 3 times that week. Each modification brought temporary improvement. Within hours, the failure rates returned to catastrophic levels. The enemy seemed to anticipate every adjustment. Hitler received the reports at his East Prussia headquarters. His rage echoed through the concrete bunkers of the Wolf's Lair. He accused the scientists of incompetence. He threatened the launch crews with execution for sabotage. He ordered production doubled despite the failures. The Führer refused to accept that his wonder weapons had been defeated by an invisible enemy. German missile crews struggled with the psychological impact of constant failure. They performed their duties flawlessly. They watched successful launches. They tracked perfect flight paths. Then, inevitably, the missiles would veer away in the final moments. Some operators suffered nervous breakdowns. Others requested transfers to conventional artillery units where they could see their enemies. The crisis extended beyond the missile program. Resources poured into weapons that no longer functioned. Each V2 rocket consumed materials equivalent to 6 fighter aircraft. The alcohol fuel for one missile could have powered a dozen tanks. Skilled engineers who might have improved conventional weapons instead worked on guidance systems that no longer guided anything. The human cost proved staggering. 30,000 slave laborers toiled in the Mittelwerk tunnels. They worked 12-hour shifts in conditions that killed thousands. Guards executed workers who moved too slowly. Disease spread through the cramped quarters. All this suffering produced weapons that crashed harmlessly into the English countryside. The Allied jamming program had achieved something remarkable. Each electronic warfare unit could neutralize dozens of incoming missiles. A single truck-mounted jammer protected an area of several square miles. The operators worked regular shifts. They went home to their families after duty. They faced no more danger than any other support personnel stationed around London. The mathematics of the exchange revealed the futility of the German position. Germany spent approximately 3 billion Reichsmarks on the V-weapon program. This included research, development, production, and deployment. The American jamming program cost less than $50 million. For every dollar spent on jammers, Germany wasted $60 on useless missiles. Lives saved by the jammers numbered in the tens of thousands. Without electronic protection, London would have suffered devastating casualties. Each V2 carried a 1-ton warhead capable of destroying entire buildings. The V1's smaller payload still killed everyone within a 100-foot radius. Historical estimates suggest that successful missile attacks would have killed at least 20,000 additional civilians. The strategic implications went beyond immediate casualties. If the missiles had maintained their effectiveness, Britain might have sought a negotiated peace. The psychological impact of unstoppable weapons raining down on London could have broken civilian morale. Instead, Londoners learned that the dreaded buzz bombs usually crashed before reaching the city. Fear turned to contempt. Germany was forced to abandon its guided missile strategy by November 1944. They switched to unguided V2s aimed at general areas rather than specific targets. These weapons could not be jammed, but proved far less effective. They struck randomly, often hitting empty fields or residential areas with no military value. The precision that made the weapons fearsome had been eliminated. The multiplication effect of the jammers cannot be overstated. Each device could operate continuously for months. A single jammer might defeat hundreds of missiles over its operational lifetime. Meanwhile, each German missile could be used only once. This disparity in reusability made the electronic defense infinitely more efficient than the kinetic offense. The truth emerged in May 1946 when Allied technical teams declassified the electronic warfare program. German scientists gathered at a facility near Frankfurt to review the captured documents. Werner von Braun sat in stunned silence as American engineers explained the jamming technology. The solution had been so simple. They had broadcast noise across the guidance frequencies, nothing more. One German engineer calculated they were 10 years behind the Americans in electronic warfare. Another simply shook his head and muttered about industrial capacity. They had been defeated not by superior strategy or courage, but by assembly lines in Detroit and Chicago. Democratic workers had outproduced totalitarian slaves. The irony was complete. Germany had created the first guided missiles. They had pioneered radio control technology. They had built weapons that should have changed warfare forever. Yet they watched these perfect weapons fall uselessly from the sky, never understanding why. The lesson was clear. Mass-producing good enough jammers mattered more than crafting perfect missiles. The Americans built effective devices by the tens of thousands. The Germans built brilliant weapons by the hundreds. In modern industrial warfare, quantity had its own quality. The impossible numbers on von Reichert's desk were never impossible. They were inevitable.